Mandarin has a lot of dubbed content. Just like with any other big language, we can find lots of things like Japanese anime to Western live-action TV shows in order to help with your Mandarin immersion. In fact, I'd say you could even double the amount of options if you find it interesting yourself. And with this being said, I've been learning Mandarin for around 2 years myself at around a B1 level. And during these 2 years, a lot of the time was put into using lots of dubbed and translated media from other languages translated into Mandarin. However, there's a bit of a debate going on in many other communities whether or not dubbed content or translated content should be used as learning material in order to boost your Mandarin. Simple answer to that, yeah, because it's still native content after all. If natives can understand it, well, I can understand it. And with this being said, I want to go over why translated and dubbed content is really beneficial other than just the fact that it's, well, understandable in the first place, and also give a bit of disclaimers when using dubbed content as well, because just like with all pieces of content, it's not perfect. And also, this is going to be start of a new series, where this new series is I'm going to be talking about pieces of content in Mandarin or language learning. I've started with things like novels, and even with the last video talking about how you should be using pieces of content and not really caring about naturalness about it. There's going to be more of that general naturalness, unnaturalness video, but taking bits and pieces of content or certain genres of content and condensing it, telling my own opinions and experiences with them. So let's go first talk about dubbed content itself, because dubbed and translated content is a very, very wide spectrum of pieces of content, because there's lots of different types of dubs, there's lots of different types of translation, there's the written part, there's the spoken part, there's all these things. There's lots of also fluctuating a bunch of qualities. There are some really, really good dubs and ones that just really suck.
This must be the place where Yamato Takeru no Mikoto came down from the sky. What the heck is this now?
Yes, that's pretty much how dubs work, where it can be very hit or miss. If a dub or translation is done really well, then it really slaps. But if it just falls flat, yeah, it just really sucks. It's just a big pain to watch. Let's go over some of the pros of using dubbed content or translated content. Also, the degree you want to be using dubbed content can also differ on your motivation to learn Mandarin. For example, my motivation to learn is in order to better communicate myself and not be seen as an outsider. And as a result, then using dubbed content may not be as big of a problem. However, if you're someone that wants to be consuming Mandarin or immersing in Mandarin just because you want to be able to watch lots of native Mandarin media, then perhaps you won't find dubbed content as useful as someone like me, because you're someone that wants to really get into the Mandarin content and not really be sticking around with dubs. I completely understand that, and that is a completely legitimate reason to learn Mandarin, so don't worry about that. But let me go talk about the pros of using dubs. So first of all, the one thing I want to talk about right away is something that I've mentioned a lot of times before, which is you can use it as a catalyst for your understanding, because there's going to be a lot of things you've already watched in your native language or another language that you've studied. And as a result, if you are able to get dubs in Mandarin from these languages that you have learned before or your native language, it's going to be a lot easier to understand it, especially when you're still a beginner and don't really understand anything. And immersion from day one is very, very important. Despite it being a very difficult task, it is something that must be done. And having dubs and the things that you already know can really make that process a lot easier, and also gives that sort of sense of nostalgia or familiarity right away without having to go straight into native media and try to immerse in it, or trying to use English subtitles and watching through the whole thing and having to do double the amount of work for just like gains of one episode, where rather instead you could get a piece of dubbed media and usually it'd be something a lot easier, and then use it again so that you can have that as your first piece of, let's say, more comprehensible media that is geared a bit more towards natives as well, and not just simply just babies or learners like us. And motivation also, I've talked about it again, where motivation can be a bit of a fluctuating thing. So not only translated and dubbed content can be really good for things like, your comprehension, but also can be very, very good for helping you find your interest in your target language early on. Because think about it, because here, if we want to, let's say, immerse in things that are more animated, for example, Mandarin definitely has a lot of them, which is called donghua. They're also really good. Please watch them. However, Mandarin has a lot more also of this live action part. And if we were to, let's say, allow ourselves to be able to immerse in things, let's say, for example, Japanese anime or Western cartoons, then as a result, our pretty much interest has expanded a lot and we can be a lot more flexible in picking out those things. And as a result, we'll be learning for longer. And of course, we'll get more fluent in the long run. And just this being said is that if you also want to find pieces of content that you may also not find very interesting in your target language, then it's very easy to use dubs as a way in order to find interests that you usually wouldn't find in your Mandarin journey. For example, with books as well, I've been able to find reading light novels, Japanese translated ones, a lot more enjoyable. However, in Mandarin, it's been a lot harder to find certain light novels that are a little bit more at my level, but also like a bit of an easier read. So that also is a really good example of just where you can find interests in your target language without having to just only stick with just pure native content. Okay, but I really can't deny that dubbed content does also have some of its drawbacks as well. And the biggest drawback, and this is the main reason why lots of people usually don't really like dubbed content as well, is that it doesn't really cover a lot of cultural aspects of a language that you're learning. For example, let's say we're going to be watching a Japanese anime, but it's dubbed in Mandarin. Sure, a lot of the Mandarin news is like 99%, let's say, similar to the Mandarin, just use the native content. However, there are certain words. For example, 我要开动了, which is like a translation from Mandarin to Japanese from, I forgot the Japanese word, but it's like something around the definition of, let's say, let's eat, like say for people, or like, oh, I'm gonna be starting to eat. I don't know the Japanese word. I'll probably show it up on the screen here. But with this being said, it just goes to show that there's also like lots of cultural things that can appear, like say translated from Mandarin, translated from a native language to Mandarin. And even though the translation can make sense, this can also be an issue where certain words don't really get used a lot in actual Mandarin content that's native or Mandarin sort of conversations. Although I already explained how this isn't really a big problem, especially in the last video where I talked about how all content is unnatural, where it's very easy to start correcting your speech if you already know that, let's say, a word doesn't really get used a lot in said daily speech. And even if you do make that mistake, it's not the end of the world. They'll just sort of like have like a small laugh and then they'll just like tell you, oh, you just say this instead. And also, we also have to mention that a lot of Mandarin terms, especially Chengyi, also don't get used a lot in, well, dubbed content as well, because Chengyi is also another way of saying idioms. And in a lot of literature, more especially, there's a lot less Chengyu used in translated content, because translated content also tends to be usually dumbed down a bit, which actually can be a really good thing, especially when you're still a beginner and you need to be able to like sort of build that foundation a bit better, and you really have a lot of a harder time and not really have any choice of whether or not you can immerse in this or that. But with the lack of Chengyu and other like certain Mandarin phrases used by natives, it can be also a bit more awkward, because as a result, you really sort of don't know like certain, let's say, cultural references that are really found a lot in, let's say, native media, but hardly found in things like dubbed media. And finally, I'm going to be talking about dubbing accent as well. This is also not very big of an issue as well. However, most of the dubbed content that I've found has been either dubbed in two things, which is standard Mandarin from the mainland or Taiwanese Mandarin, more on the Taiwanese Mandarin. Because, for example, if you're going to be learning these two accents, then it's going to be a lot more plausible to be immersing in dubs. However, if you're not going to be immersing, or you don't really plan to have an accent in these two, then it's probably best that you don't really try to consume certain dubs of a certain, let's say, well, accent, and you probably try to like consume dubs and like other things, or of course native content as well. And as I said again and again, it doesn't really matter in the long run. However, if you are someone that's looking to really improve their accent, especially if you're going to try picking up sort of like that material that you need in order to properly, let's say, shadow or let's say imitate as you go along, then it's probably not going to be dubbed content, and you'd probably much rather look for things that are a lot more radio talk, podcast type of things where you could properly repeat after what the person says as well. And also, dubbed content also isn't that great for usually testing your level. This is also not a very big downside, but if you're going to be testing your level in a language, it's best that you don't use dubbed content. Well, if you're going to be someone like me and Refold and like sort of test their comprehension level, I usually test things on dubbed content because, I just, like them, like in the last video. But if you really want to test like what's a real Mandarin level, it's best that you don't use just dubbed content alone. And that's really all I have to say about the downsides of dubbed content. I also do want to introduce one more very big important part about dubbed content, which is cultural importance. Yes, because there's also a lot of dubbed and translated media that, while they're not made in the target country of your target language, they are actually still very important to immerse in. And if you can learn them, you could probably unlock a lot of new conversations. Let's say, for example, Dragon Ball with Spanish, because Dragon Ball is very popular in Latin America. Although it's not as popular as beforehand, it's still a very big thing. And there's also been news of fights being put up. I think an episode of a Dragon Ball fight episode, and then lots of people came to it. And in fact, it got even some conflict from Japan because of it was like government sponsored. I don't know the full thing, but you can probably look it up yourself. And also, another thing, I can give an example in Mandarin, is also one piece of content I've been immersing in, Detective Conan, where it's a very popular long-running show in Mandarin-speaking countries, especially in China and Taiwan. And things like, for example, Doraemon and Crayon Shinshin, these two things as well have also been very popular with children in order to immerse in. So if you're able to, let's say, take a look at these pieces of content and get yourself a little familiar with them and immerse in them, then it's going to be a lot easier in order to, let's say, open up a lot of conversation topics where you can talk about, oh, I've been watching this. It's like, how do you like it? It's like, oh, I really like it too. These things is that not all dubbed content also is like bad in a way, like it's not going to close you off from culture. In fact, it could probably open you up to it as well. Yeah. Okay, so that's all I have to say about learning Mandarin with dubs. Honestly, although it may seem like there's a lot of downsides to it, it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things as long as you consume a bit more of the native content. And like I just said again, it's still something that natives can understand. So please do not worry about whether or not a piece of dubbed content is something that you should or should not watch all the time. If it's something that interests you, please go ahead and watch it.